Roald Dahl is a storybook writer born on September 13th, 1916 in Wales, aka my homeland. The man was a legend at creating storybooks, and most of his stories were adapted into films such as The Witches, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Magic Matilda, James and the Giant Peach, and many, many others. My personal favourite would have to be Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, even though it's already been adapted into two films. The 2005 one by Tim Burton is by far my favourite. Now, the 1971 version was a classic by millions. Even I can understand that it's a classic, but I always preferred the 2005 version because there was more story to it. The characters had more character. It had a satisfying soundtrack, more satisfying scenes, and a better ending. Now, I'm not trying to say that it's a perfect film, but I would watch it any day over the 1971 version any day. But we're not going to be talking about Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory. We're going to be talking about the Twits. And as a child, I absolutely adored this story. I remember every Roald Dahl, like on Roald Dahl Day back in 2015, my teacher brought out this book of the Twits. And this was the first time I ever really heard of the story. But as we were starting to read it and getting to know the characters, I ended up falling in love with it. The story is about Mr. and Mrs. Twit, both of which who are not very nice looking and not very kind to each other, and they get up to all sorts of pranks. And then one day their pranks fire back, and yeah, I can't really explain the ending to you because I'm not that type of person who likes to spoil stuff. So if you haven't seen it, I do recommend checking it out for yourself. But anyway, back in 2015, I was too young to even have a social media account, even though I longed to be a director. But back then, we used to get like pieces of paper and some what are they called again? Staplers, and create our own storybooks. And, you know, after reading a lot of Roald Dahl stories, including the Twits, I think it played a good role on doing me on creating my stories. So, in other words, I have the Twits to thank. But 10 years later, the Twits return in an animated film made by Netflix. And what's my thoughts on it?
The word beautiful doesn't even begin to describe it, because it's shit.
Yeah, Twits 2025. Let's get straight into it. The story, in my opinion, is my least favourite part. It doesn't even feel like it's trying to emulate the original source material. But don't get me wrong, there are certain things in the film that, you know, are from the book. Like, it's got the frogs, it's got the wormy spaghetti, it's got the monkeys that stand on their heads. But for the most part, the Twits aren't really shown in the film that often, and are more focused on the orphan kids throughout the film. And these orphans weren't really a part of the original storybook, as far as I remember. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but even though I don't like Wes Anderson's Fantastic Mr. Fox, at least it actually felt like it wanted to be part of the story. It felt like it wanted to like redo the story, but in movie form. But this Twit, on the other hand, just doesn't feel like it wants anything to do with the original. And in my opinion, this representation of the original story feels like another one of those woke liberal propaganda films, because they do reference politics within this film, mainly American politics. And yeah, by the way, this film is set in America above all places. Although it's not really specified what country the Twits actually live in, I do feel like the Americanization of certain media is getting very tiresome. I did say that the film felt like it had nothing to do with the original story, and you can pretty much say the same thing about Walt Disney's Pinocchio, but the difference with that one is that it actually changed up the story for the greater good. This 2025 version of the Twits just feels like it's changing up the story to fit the modern generation. Now, aside from the Twits themselves, who are meant to be the main people of the story, I mentioned before that the film seems more focused on the orphan kids rather than the Twits. Bisha and Bubsy are the two main characters who are orphans who try to stop the Twits. There isn't really much to say about these two other than they're just there for the sake of God knows what reason. But one thing I will talk about is the monkeys within this film. Now, in the original 1980s story of the Twits, they had these pet monkeys that, make them do tricks and everything. But in the 2025 version, they completely changed them up to be like these whole different type of creature known as a mugglewump with magnificent magic powers, which wasn't really part of the story. But what really was part of the story, however, was the word mugglewump. But that was mainly a slang name specifically for the monkeys. Now, you could make the argument that this is a kids' film and you're allowed to have such wacky characters, but this just feels so far removed from the original source material that without any deeper meaning, it just feels pointless. We also have these two insects. One's a son and the other's a mother, and the mother is telling the kid the story, and they're doing it inside Mr. Twit's beard, but I get that Mr. Twit has a very scruffy beard with all sorts of nasty stuff in it, but I don't recall the insects being inside of it. I mean, I don't really know, to be fair, because it has been a really long time since I've read the story, but this scene in particular reminds me so much of the squirrel scene from the Gruffalo. I say what sets the squirrel scene apart from the insects in the Twits is that in the Gruffalo, the squirrels were actually referenced in the original storybooks, but with the insects in the Twits, I don't really recall them being in it. I mean, the Twits was a very long story, and it's been a very long time since I have last read it, so clearly I'm missing something. But if I am missing anything, please let me know in the comments. The humour. And was the humour any good? Sadly, no. It was diabolical.
Diorama. What?
Yet it's just that typical cheap toilet humour that you see in every animated film these days. But granted, toilet humour can work depending on how it's handled. But I get that it's the Twit and they're meant to be scruffy and odd, but the humour really doesn't work. I'm going to drop a few spoilers here, but I don't think you guys really care. The wormy spaghetti part I would have put in the section of humour because it was a very funny scene, at least in the original storybook. The Twits 2025 representation of the wormy spaghetti scene just felt far too quick and too, it just wasted the whole spaghetti. Like, in the original storybook, Mr. Twit just eats the whole lot and then wipes his face and then just asks why why it was squishy until Mrs. Twit finally confesses that it was worms in his spaghetti. But in this part of the story, he just eats it, only like a quarter of it, and then Mrs. Twit just starts telling him, and then, it just does not work. And I've seen better parodies of this by amateurs on YouTube. To be honest, I don't really feel like I have any positives to say about the film. I'd say the only positive I really have is the animation is actually decent. Like, it's not perfect, but you can definitely tell that they have put in effort into, like, the characters' expressions, the characters' movements, and all of that. It's just typically animated, but at the same time, I don't think I can appreciate the designs of the characters as well, because all of it, just right down to the detail, just looks very typical. Like, I feel like I have seen this animation time and time again. Now here, I'm going to drop a major spoiler, so if you haven't seen the book or the movie, I do recommend checking them out. But here we go. So, in the very end of the movie, the Twits end up hanging themselves upside down on the heads until their bodies shrink into the bodies. No, the legs like shrink into the bodies all the way down to the edge to where they basically it's the faith of them. And in the original storybook, that was pretty much it. And they did show like a little clip in the movie where it actually does happen, but that was only really a dream thing that the kids imagined. And when I initially seen that clip, where it had Mrs. Twit's eye rolling towards the camera and it fades to black, I genuinely thought that was going to be the actual end and it was going to roll the end credits afterwards. But it doesn't. Instead, the kids start feeling bad for them, so they go back to their house to get them unstuck, and so now they're free to roam again. because this is a kid's film at the end of the day, and it's modern, so we can't have the main villains actually meet their fate. We have to like treat them like equals. Now, in all honesty, I did not like the execution that the film had for its ending, because it's almost like it's trying to make out like kids are too sensitive to watch people getting killed in, like, you know, certain shows and that, and so it's in certain ways, really. But the scene that they had, the way the Twits met their ending, it just didn't really seem that graphic to me. And besides, I've grew up watching things like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and seeing a chicken literally get its head cut off. And I've always found it dead satisfying when I see villains like Judge Claude Frollo fall to his death in the Hellfire in that Hunchback of Notre Dame film. This ending for the Twits is a good example of the point I'm trying to make. Just because it's marketed to kids doesn't mean you can't hit them with the heavy stuff. Now, you still can, but there is like a level to it, and the level that the Twits has done, and they've just ended up ruining it in the end. You know, it really wasn't that bad to begin with, but they just have to, like, you know, stop them from dying anyway. So, the point that I'm trying to make is that, you know, kids obviously need to go through life being happy, because happiness is a good, way of expression, but that doesn't mean, like, you can't, like, say to them that everything about the world is good no matter what. You do need to, like, let them learn all the bad stuffs and the negatives while simultaneously going through life trying to not, like, being aware of it, but still being happy at the same time. Kind of like me, for example, because I did tell you beforehand that I watched the old Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory and remembered being scared of that chicken getting its head cut off. But the more I watched that and the more I grew up, the more I became desensitized to it. Not like I'm going to do it myself, but just didn't really find it as scary as I did back then. And that's a good thing, and that's something that most kids need these days. Like, they can't just go through life being all happy and smiley and then getting dead sensitive over, you know, the bad stuff, like what I've just, what the things that I've experienced, because then they'll just go through a very unbalanced, you know, way of life. And that's, I think that's a problem that all of us have in today's society. And that is Twits 2025. What an absolute shit show of a movie this was. This doesn't even feel like the Twits. This just feels like a completely different film that just had the Roald Dahl brand slapped on it just to gain attention of the viewers. The only things that were consistent about this film compared to the book was Mr. and Mrs. Twit themselves, the monkeys and the wormy spaghetti, and that's just about it. Everything else is just very unnecessary. They're all just unnecessary changes. Like the story is inconsistent compared to the original book. There's random characters who we don't even know about. There's just there's not the humor, but like the actual just everything else in general. Everything about this film is just very inconsistent to the book. And let's not forget the fact that the original Twits was based somewhere in the UK, but the movie just went ahead and decided to just Americanize the entire film. Everything in the film is Americanized except for like Mr. Twit's accent, and that's pretty much it. It's a very unnecessary change. In fact, it's a very common change that happens, you know, with most shows that come out from the UK. The Americans sort of want to like Americanize it just to fit them, which, you know, I understand, but at the same time, it just ruins the charm of, you know, British humour and that. But maybe that's just how I see it. Now, in other words, this movie was far from good. It had painfully diabolical humour, inaccurate story, inaccurate characters, an inaccurate plot, random characters, and the list goes on. I do recommend not checking out the film. And if you do somehow get into the Twits, just read the story. It's a much better, and if anything, it's the original. So the originals are always the best ones. So that's pretty much everything I have to say about this film. That is it for this video. I am Star Invader, and I'll see you all in the next video.